Well, hello. Welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs and to our first event for 2022. My name's Alistair Roff. I'm Executive Director of AIIA in Victoria, and it's great to have you all with us. So warm welcome to members of AIIA, to our other guests, and to members of the Diplomatic Corps. The talk will run for about 40 minutes or so. We'll take questions after that. So feel free to put any questions in the Q&A tab. We'll get through as many as we can. So to discuss the Biden administration and democracy promotion and the challenges that are arising both abroad and at home, we're delighted to welcome back Professor Bruce Gentleson. Bruce is William Preston Few Professor of Public Policy and Professor of Political Science at Duke University. Currently, he's a Distinguished Fellow of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He served in a number of US foreign policy positions, including as Senior Advisor to the State Department Policy Planning Director in the Obama administration. And his Aussie connection, 2 years ago, he held the Des Ball Chair at the College of Asia and the Pacific at ANU. So Bruce, thank you so much for joining us from Washington. I'll hand over to you and I'll see you in the Q&A.
Okay. Well, thanks to Alistair and the Australian Institute for another invitation to be with you again. It's actually almost 2 years to the day in 2020 when I left the United States to come to ANU for a period of residence with the Des Ball Chair. It was a wonderful opportunity, both colleagues at ANU and other universities. I was in Melbourne at Monash and in Sydney at the US Studies Center, and also to have a series of meetings with people in the Australian government while I was in Canberra. We got cut short by COVID. I ended up having to leave around late March when the people we were renting an apartment from said, either leave now or you may be here till September. September might have been an underestimation. And so it's been great to join you by Zoom, but I actually wish that you could somehow transmit a nice Aussie flat white that Starbucks just can't match them on this end. And every time I lament that I didn't have more time in Australia in 2020, I remind myself that 2021 and 2022 would have been impossible. I also had a wonderful set of days towards the end in early March when I'd come to Melbourne to give some talks at Monash, had lunch with your former Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, who I've worked with for a number of years, both when I've been in policy positions in academic world, and I've become a friend and a colleague. And I think one of the last big events that I was at before COVID hit was seeing Come From Away at the theater in Melbourne. Probably appropriate, I guess. When I've given talks with your group before, it's been really valuable to have time for questions and discussion. This is a very big topic, so if you'll excuse the fact that I'm just going to make some points about it, but try to watch the time and leave us, because as Alice just said, a good 20 minutes at the end for any questions and discussion that you may have on these issues as well. And our topic of American democracy promotion and American foreign policy challenges brought at home, I really have to start here at home. And I'm going to do that by getting a bit personal to start. One of the first jobs I had out of college before I started my doctoral studies and professor career was in 1975. And I was working for a nonprofit foundation here in DC that was running a government studies program for secondary students, high school students in our system, to bring them to Washington so they could learn about the government. And the people that founded the program were doing this the year after Watergate, and really in the last year of the Vietnam War, a period of great disillusionment with American politics and policy. And a big part of that program was taking these young 15, 16-year-olds to the Congress, to the Capitol building, to meet with their senators and representatives and to get a tour and understand the history and the like. And then as my own career went on, I worked in the US Senate twice as a foreign policy aide, once for a Republican senator in the late 1970s, Most of my work has been for Democrats, but this was a particular Republican senator that I had known pretty well. He was what we used to call a moderate Republican on foreign policy and other issues. And the other was for Senator, then Senator Al Gore in the late 1980s. And then I worked for Al Gore while he was vice president and in his 2000 presidential campaign as a foreign policy advisor. So I don't want to overdo the reverence for the building and the institution, but I, as jaded as I may be after all these years, I feel a lot of that. And January 6th was such a profound, disturbing series of events. It was not just a demonstration that got out of hand, that got violent. It was not even just an insurrection. It was a coup attempt. In fact, the word for coup in Spanish is so much more powerful. It's a golpe. It was an effort at a golpe. And some of that was evident at the time, and much has come more evident as there's been efforts to look at the planning and the networks and everything that went into this through the congressional hearings, through investigative journalists and others. All of our Western democracies have been having issues over COVID and vaccination and the like, but no other Western democracy has witnessed anything close to this type of political violence in recent years. And it's continued. In fact, in some ways, I would say, well, I won't say more disturbing, but disturbing in its own right is the levels of political violence and threats that are happening in the United States at the local levels, against school board members for certain kinds of curriculum policies, against election officials whose names nobody ever heard of before, getting death threats, and a variety of things. And we can talk more about this in the discussion. I think it's very important to understand that Donald Trump was part of this, but he was an effect of it, not just cause. That the roots of this run much deeper. The rise of militias, for example, has been going on for a couple of decades, and are much, much deeper, to the point where I actually think back to one of the last lectures I gave in Australia before I left in March 2020. I was asked to talk in a public lecture at ANU on the upcoming election, the 2020 election. And, one of the points I made, the analogy I've used then and I've used since is to currency fluctuations. When we look at the value of our international currencies, it's okay if they fluctuate within a band, right? That international market says, okay, it goes up a little bit, it goes down a little bit. When the currency value goes outside that band, then there's great concern economically, devaluation, a variety of other aspects. If you look at the last 25 or so years of our politics, we have been outside that band of normal fluctuation called the political currency fluctuation time and again. In 1998, we tried to impeach a president of the United States on some terrible personal behavior, in a country where there had only been two efforts of impeachment in its entire history. One in 1867, Andrew Johnson, the president after Abraham Lincoln, and that didn't pass. And the other, 1974, Nixon resigned before impeachment. An effort to impeach a president in 1998. In 2000, we had a presidential election. Again, I don't think I'm being partisan when I was saying this, even though I was an advisor to Vice President Gore and remember election night all too well. We had an election that had to be decided in the Supreme Court, never before in American history. In 2003, we go to war in Iraq, and a war that many people in the world opposed. In 2007, 8, 9, we have the U.S. markets-driven international financial crisis, right? Our economy that had been the engine in many ways of the international economy since World War II was now crashing the international economy. In 2008, we elect a very different kind of president, African-American president, Barack Obama, that, well, on the one hand, many people in the world were very happy about that. Talk about a fluctuation, swing of the pendulum. And in 2016, we elect a very different kind of president, swing the pendulum in a very different direction, Donald Trump. then we go through everything we had in the Trump year. So when I was there in March 2020, I basically said, whatever the outcome of this election, and at that point, it wasn't even clear Joe Biden was going to be the presidential nominee of the Democratic Party. My point was that those who would prefer to see Biden as president rather than Trump would be happy about that. But the confidence of that staying within the band of political currency fluctuation was not something that I could be real optimistic about. And we have a 2022 election coming up. We have a 2024, and also January 6th and everything that's happened. So the notion of what's happening to American democracy has taken it from one that's emulated in many ways around the world, not perfect, but more often emulated, to one that's highly endangered. That's part of the context. I want to move to the abroad part now for foreign policy and democracy promotion about that. When Alistair first contacted me about this, he had seen a series of articles I had written that related to the Summit for Democracy that President Biden held in December 2021. And I wrote these with a colleague, Jim Goldgeier, who's a fellow at Brookings Institution and a professor at American University. And the first article we wrote actually in December 2020, during the presidential transition, and having gone through presidential transitions with Bill Clinton, Al Gore, with Barack Obama, it's a very useful time to take campaign promises and try to have some input, whether or not they really become policies. And again, cards on the table, transparency. Many of the people in the administration are friends and colleagues. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is somebody I know and work with well, Secretary of State Blinken, and a number of others. And so we really were actually advising them not to go ahead with this democracy summit in a constructive way. We thought it was not a good idea, which didn't mean we didn't believe in democracy. And I'll try to convince you of that. The two reasons that they did decide to go ahead with it, and by the way, that first article we wrote in December 2020, after January 6th, Foreign Affairs, where these were published, asked us to write another article about now after January 6th. And part of that, as you can see, was, makes it even harder to be the ones hosting a summit for democracy. The two main reasons the Biden administration went ahead with it, one was to highlight that the break was with Trump's sort of hey bro approach to autocrats around the world, be they Vladimir Putin, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Brazil's Bolsonaro, Turkey's Erdogan, even some efforts to charm Xi Jinping, just to show that there was a break. And the second was a networking opportunity for collaborative initiatives, including among NGOs and civil society, not just governments. Both were worthy goals, but in our sense, they had a number of downsides. And one of the downsides we tried to stress was the invitation list. Some were easy invites, like Australia, New Zealand, much of Western Europe, but many others were not. And we all take geopolitics into account. That's a fact of foreign policy life. But for invitations to a summit billed as for democracy, this really became especially problematic. And so there was Poland, which was reliably anti-Russia, and by the time the summit happened was having the weaponization of refugees by Belarus. It was also at that time being fined 1 million euros a day by the European Union Court of Justice for its judicial and media policies. There was the Philippines, where President Duterte had sort of ended some of his dalliance with Beijing and it started realigning with the US. It was also the country that journalist Maria Ressa received the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of her efforts, and I quote, to expose abuses of power, use of violence, and growing authoritarianism in her native country. There was Brazil and Bolsonaro, who styled himself the tropical Trump. And there was India, at a time in which the Quad had become much more important, but also, according to the Scandinavian International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, have been ranked the worst among all backsliding democracies. And Modi and his attacks on Indian Muslims were so severe as to be likened to the Nazi Kristallnacht. And the anti-terrorism law that he got passed was being exploited for wide-reaching political arrests and the like. And so our point was, if you invite these people to a Summit for Democracy because you have geopolitical reasons, you A, undermine the credibility of really being supportive of democracy, and B, risk them leaving saying, you see, because we're important to the United States geostrategically, they let all our anti-democracy things slide. And that's kind of what happened. In fact, right before the summit, Politico, which some of you may read, invited us to write a shorter article called sort of a lemonade out of lemons. Now that they've decided to have the summit, do you guys have any ideas about how they can at least, make the best of it? And one of the things we stressed was that you should send messages to all of these leaders, to the Polish president, that while the U.S. stands with them against Belarus's weaponization of migrants, it also supports the efforts of the EU Court of Justice. And in Philippines, that in a country where back in the Marcos era, in that transition to democracy in 1986, after the assassination of Benigno Aquino in 1983, the US, in a very bipartisan way, actually Republicans and Democrats in Congress brought Reagan around to help ensure that that 86 election was fair and led to a transition to democracy. And there were plenty of problems. But with the election upcoming in which the ticket is Marcos's son and Duterte's daughter, it would be important to say that we remember what we did in 1986 and we're not giving you a free pass, and on and on and on. I could go. With India, I think something to pay attention to. In March of 2021, when the Biden administration first came in, the State Department's annual human rights report was quite critical on human rights violations. And the India-US security partnership, Quad, has grown more significant in the years since then. It'll be very interesting to watch when that report comes out in March, whether it's at least as critical as last year's, or if it's another effort to let the democracy aspects slide. And since the summit, there's been evidence, from Poland and elsewhere, that the leaders did go back and say, we basically have a free pass. So if you want to prove that you're for democracy, part of our argument was skip the summit, get to work. USAID, the Agency for International Development, which does a lot of our democracy promotion, had a very dynamic new leader, Ambassador Samantha Power, had been demoralized from the inside. I know from talking to a lot of people, who work there and either left or thought of leaving, needed a budget increase. Get to work, get out there, show that we're going to support democracy efforts, official and unofficial, around the world, rather than put all this resources and bandwidth into a summit. We sometimes put too much emphasis on summits. And so that was kind of the argument about the summit, about what our concern was and why, again, it wasn't saying we didn't believe democracy should be valued. But there are two other deeper reasons that went beyond the summit. One is, if we're honest about it, and we're not just thinking about all the terrible things of Trump and his administration, it's really important to ask the question of how committed has US foreign policy been historically to democracy. Trump was the worst, but you could go back to the first half of the 20th century, and the United States intervened militarily in one Latin American country after another, long before Castro, in Cuba, in Nicaragua, in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, largely because of our economic interest, even when there were democratic governments there. In the Cold War, while we stood up against, for Soviet dissidents like Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and supported the Helsinki process that helped keep alive the Václav Havels of the world, with many of our allies, particularly in the so-called third world, our criteria for democracy was basically ABC, anybody but a communist. And we lumped in that category many third world nationalist leaders emerging in Latin America and Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East. We can point to Marcos, we can point to, Suharto in Indonesia. I think we all kind of know the list. So it was not clear. In fact, the period in which the United States put the most emphasis on human rights and democracy was the Carter administration, for which he was highly criticized, in which he tried to make it a priority and cut back on the support we were giving at the time to the Chilean military, to the Argentinian military, to the Brazilian military. Post 9/11, it switched from ABC to ABT, anybody but a terrorist. And our attitude in the Arab Spring in 2010, 2011 was ambivalent. We did support Mubarak leaving office, but with the Morsi, the Islamic Brotherhood government, and we got much more kind of mixed in ways, and we can talk more about this, that were not justified by their policies. Just one example, in the 2012 Gaza war, Morsi, the Islamic Brotherhood president, worked with the United States and Israel to try to bring that Gaza war to an end. It's been very glaring with the Saudis, including the Biden administration, where we imposed sanctions on some of the aides to Crown Prince, to MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, despite the CIA, our own CIA, the Biden CIA, confirming that the Crown Prince had been directly implicated in the brutal murder of Khashoggi in Turkey, who happened to be an American resident and journalist for the Washington Post, as well as a Saudi citizen. So the pattern we see historically, if we're honest, is that we've given more priority on democracy and human rights against adversaries than with allies. With the Uyghurs, to a certain extent with Tiananmen Square back in the late 80s, early 90s, with Navalny in Russia, with Castro, with Venezuela, we stand for democracy and human rights, but it intersects with what we see as our security interests. And when there's been a tension between the two, not all the time, but we really, in many respects, in these relations with countries we believe we have security interests on, we've opted for the security interests. Now, again, that may be geopolitics, but you can't do that and also say you are the world's defender of democracy. And part of what my own view is from, again, being involved in policy, but also from the outside, is there's sort of a Hippocratic oath on this about, do no harm, that in many respects, we can have more influence on those countries that we have relationships with through aid, through a variety of other things, through leveraging the relationship, than we can with the adversaries. It's sad to say, but true, that, the pressure on China, on the Uyghurs, that's come from us, it's come from Australia, it's come from Western Europe, hasn't really changed the situation very much. Similarly with Russia, similarly with others. It doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't do it, but we get a lot of mileage out of that, and we kind of grow askance. So it wasn't just Donald Trump. He was absolutely the worst thing. But the question of the balance between security interests and democracy has been an ongoing issue in the United States, and we shouldn't have a rose-colored view about somehow having really, been very consistent in this way. And if we are going to be more consistent, we've got to do it by acknowledging this tension and proceeding from there. The other point, again, is this question about whether or not democracy versus autocracy is really the main dynamic of the 21st century world. There's no question that we have many affinities with fellow democracies that we do not share with autocracies. We have that with Australia. We have that with many countries. There are many ways in which there's a lot that we share by virtue of being democracies. A lot of bonds, some of those get translated into things like the Five Eyes. Some of those are just affinities that happen between our cultures and our peoples. But ideology and interest do not always align. And I don't think that that's the crucial dividing line in the 21st century. And I'll give you a number of reasons why. It's important, but ideology and interest don't align. First of all, during the Cold War, a little bit going back to what I said before, a monolithic view of global communism blinded American policymakers in the 1950s to the Sino-Soviet split that occurred by the late 1950s. We were still lumping these together in the single communist bloc that we faced. We missed many opportunities. And also, it blinded us to the distinctiveness of third world nationalism. Whether it was the early days of Ho Chi Minh in the 1940s or the African socialism that came out of colonialism, or in Latin America, where in countries like Colombia and Chile and Brazil, where we had direct hands in coups, we just lumped it all together. It was that ABC. And in many ways, it led to some of the major failures, and not just moral failures, but strategic failures in American foreign policy. The Vietnam War, the terrible massacres in Indonesia, the support of Marcos for over a decade in the Philippines, all over Latin America. And so this over ideology aspect. In fact, it's useful just to remind people that George Kennan, the father of containment, always believed, in fact, he resigned from government in the 1950s, that containment was the strategy for dealing with the Soviet threat, particularly in Europe, somewhat in the Eurasian landmass, but in Europe. And as we globalized containment and militarized it to the third world, one of the earliest critics of the Vietnam War was George Kennan. Long before it was going bad, we're talking 1965, 66, and basically said America's credibility lies in Berlin, it does not lie in Saigon, and this is not a war that you can win. And so the over ideology element of American foreign policy has created huge problems for us and others in the world before. And this notion that we're seeing the world that way, hey, they're the autocrats, we're the Democrats. Point number one, I think it leads to big problems, both in the partners you choose and the opportunities you miss for finding shared interests, even with some governments that you don't share political ideology with. Secondly, along the same lines, is divergent political ideologies have not precluded American cooperation with Russia or China based on mutual interests, even when there's been ideological competition. There was a famous line from Franklin Roosevelt during World War II, in which he said, I can't take communism, when he talked about the alliance with Stalin, including the Lend-Lease that we gave to the Soviets as well as the Brits in 1940 before we entered the war. I can't take communism, but to cross that bridge, I would hold hands with the devil. Now Hitler was an extreme version of that. But there was not purely Machiavellian values don't count, but there was a pragmatism there. After staring into the nuclear abyss with Nikita Khrushchev in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, and again, I'll show my age, and to get a little personal, I lived in New York then, and I was a young guy, and sitting on the living room floor with my parents watching President Kennedy come on television, to talk about what was happening in Cuba. And I turned to my parents and said, are we all going to die? And they said, I think it's time for you to go to bed. Pretty good advice. But after that, looking into the abyss, one of the periods that's not given sufficient study and lessons was from October 1962 to November 1963, when John Kennedy was assassinated. There was the beginnings of a détente. In June of 1963, Kennedy gave a very famous speech, an American University graduation speech, in which he talked about coexistence. He didn't use the word détente, but he talked about ways in which we could coexist with the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1963, one of the very first the Limited Test Ban Treaty was signed by us, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France, one of the very first nuclear arms control treaties. And in October 1963, we made our first grain sale to the Soviet Union. By the late 1970s, their agriculture was terrible, but it was up and down. They had a bad year, and that was a grain sale that was even supported by Republicans and Democrats. Kennedy gets assassinated, Khrushchev gets overthrown in 64. We never quite know what would have come of that. But the point was, despite everything, we were looking for developing ways to try to work together where our interests align. In the late 1960s and the 1970s, both the United States and the Soviet Union worked with the World Health Organization, something particularly relevant today, in the global eradication of smallpox. In some ways, we competed to get the soft power credit for being a part of this. And when the WHO started the program in 1967, both countries had resources and science to contribute. And by 1979 or 80, when the WHO announced that smallpox had been eradicated from the earth, we still were in a period of Cold War. but we worked together. Obvious things, the implications obviously for COVID and whatever pandemics may lie ahead of us. And if we go back to 2014, despite the Russian annexation of Crimea and intervention in Ukraine, and despite issues with China in the South China Sea, we worked together on the 215 Iranian Nuclear Nonproliferation Agreement, the so-called JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. We had shared interests in ensuring that Iran would not be a nuclear power. And despite we had other ongoing conflicts, we worked together. And we worked with China in the 2015 Paris Climate Accord. We kind of pre-wired some of that between the two of us, which we didn't have in 2009 of the Copenhagen climate. So divergent ideology has not precluded working together on shared interests. And when you look at the transnational issues we face today, we all talk about, as we should, WMD, weapons of mass destruction. We also are facing EMD and PMD, environmental mass destruction and pandemic mass destruction. The death toll, as we all know from COVID, has been, for us, exceeds the combination of deaths we've had in almost every war other than the Civil War in our history. We all know the personal lives disruptions. We all know the economic disruptions, and on climate change. My old Al Gore roots may be showing here, but when we came in January 2020, the bushfires were still going on, and all of the other climate issues that we face. I'd written another piece talking about the way for the United States to show its global leadership in the 21st century was to really be a leader on climate change and pandemic prevention. We've done a bit more of that in the Biden administration than before, but there's much more we could be doing. And they should be the highest priorities, frankly, in my view, that we face, even more than China. I think we can deal with China without making it the highest priority, but these two issues are MD issues of a great extent. And so number one, ideology blinded us to where we had a lot of interests. Number two, it didn't stand in the way of working together with our main ideological foes. And number three, common ideology doesn't make for fully shared interests with other democracies. It never has. Not for the Iraq War. Australia supported it. Many democracies in Europe didn't. Not for the Vietnam War. And frankly, not for the isolationist United States before December 7th, 1941. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and one speculated, there's a lot of speculation still by historians, whether if Hitler had not declared war on the United States the next day, would we have entered the European War, not just the Pacific? I think we would have, because Roosevelt was trying to do that, but he faced an isolationist Congress and country over 2 years into the beginning of World War II. So even though these were shared democracies, Britain, France, and others, it did not make for fully shared interests on our part as well. And then you can go across the agenda of issues. Israel's a democracy, and the United States has had lots of disagreements with Israel, not just in the Obama years. You could go back to the George H.W. Bush and Jim Baker years, where we cut off loan guarantees to the West Bank because of disputes with them. Ronald Reagan sold the AWACS, the air defense system, to Saudi Arabia over Israeli objections. We have issues today. We may have more issues on the Iran issues. We'll see where that goes. Nord Stream 2 pipeline right now. Actually, if you're interested, I published an article in the Washington Post today. I've done a lot of work on sanctions, both in government, and I have a new book coming out in a couple of months on how sanctions work and how they don't. And I published an article today on the sanctions issue with Russia, and one of the issues was the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And a lot of people in Washington, others, criticizing the Europeans. You only care about your economic interests. Well, Europe has 9 times more trade with Russia than we do. They have an interdependence on energy, on oil and gas. They have much more stakes in terms of actual cumulative direct foreign investment. Not to justify them, not wanting to, do a deterrent against Putin, but we need to ask ourselves if she was on the other foot and we had those kind of economic interests, would we be as ready to give them up? So the point is, we have a dispute with allies, with Germany over Nord Stream 2. We have some differences in Asia over how to, what's the combination of engagement and deterrent against China. Japan and South Korea have continued to hold their trilateral summits with China. So fellow democracy does not necessarily make for shared interest. So my point, on that really is, in a world that I think of as one in which it's not going to divide into two camps. Most countries in the world today, and I would include your country, want to have relations with all the major powers. They may value the relation with the United States more than with China or Russia, but they want to have relations with all the major powers. It's to get jargony, it's a geopolitical pluralism. One sees that in the Middle East. I mean, even with everything that the Trump administration did for Israel and Saudi Arabia, the Israelis maintained trade with China. They had a deal with China to take over management of the port of Haifa. And the United States has one of the naval bases that we visit a lot there. We objected to that. The Israelis did it because it's in their interest. There have been some stories, not confirmed, that Saudi's been working with China on the beginnings of a nuclear weapons program. There are a lot of ways in which countries want to have relations with all the major powers. And all of this means that it's based upon interests with some affinities that we have as democracies. But the notion of we democracies against autocracies just runs counter to all of the lessons. And in our own politics with everything else, we really risk over and misestimating the threat. We did that in the Cold War, and we had some of the policy problems I pointed to. We also had McCarthyism in the 1950s. We've had a certain amount of violence against Asian Americans coming out of this, accentuation of the China threat. We had it against Muslims after 9/11. So we have a pattern of getting over ideological and not only having flawed foreign policies, but domestic problems as well. So just to come back home to sum up where we are, one of the areas that we do have some common interest with other democracies is the efforts at disinformation and disruption of democratic processes by Russia, by China, by Iran, by North Korea. In Australia in 2017, you had the major issues around some influence peddling and a variety of issues that legislation was passed and the like. And there is, frankly, a transnational alliance going on, which is very anti-democratic, but that's actually coming from right-wing groups. Our Fox News, part of the Murdoch empire, Tucker Carlson, who's become the leading host on it, has gone to Hungary and embraced Viktor Orban and said he's the model for us. He was on the other night basically saying, I don't know what Putin's doing wrong. So I actually worry about the transnational links between groups within our democracies that are anti-democratic, potentially fascist and the like. And so we can share information and technologies and cyber and other things in that respect. But being honest and coming back to where I started, Russia did play a role in the 2016 campaign. There's no question. I mean, again, a small personal example, I was cheering one of Hillary Clinton's foreign policy advisory groups dealing with the Middle East. And my name was out in the media. And I don't do a lot of Facebook, but I suddenly started getting a message from Facebook that my account had been hacked and it was in Cyrillic. And I would reboot it. And a few days later, we hacked again in Cyrillic. When the election was over and Hillary Clinton lost, my Facebook account was fine. So there definitely was interference. But the question, the deeper question for all of us, including those of us who are involved in that campaign, who have to take a certain amount of responsibility, why the receptivity among our electorates to those messages? That is on us. That is about our abilities of our democracies to deliver to people in ways that matter to them. That is about the polarizations we have and things we're doing to ourselves. Having political leaders who, will use any disinformation campaign, who are basically trying to destroy the electoral process in the United States going forward, and not just through the coup attempt, but through changing laws in ways all over the country at the state level. The receptivity, if there wasn't as much receptivity in some parts of our populations, then the efforts by Russia or China or North Korea or whomever to hack in and affect politics would have a lot less impact. So we've got to try to stop those efforts, but they're not the front and center issue. It really is about, can our democracies deliver in ways that make people more inclined to say, oh, that's crazy stuff. There go the Russians again, or whatever. So anyway, that brings it back home as well as foreign policy. I'm going to stop now, and I'd love to entertain any questions or conversations that you all have. So thanks very much.
Bruce, thank you very much. It's always good having you on, giving such a clear and wide-ranging overview of the issues. I'll jump around some different questions. We've had one on Ukraine. I mean, that's very topical at the moment. And just how well do you think the administration is handling the Ukraine crisis? I guess this might tie in somewhat to the op-ed you mentioned that was in the Washington Post, but did you want to talk a little bit more about Ukraine and sanctions?
Sure. I think they are, I give them a lot of credit for what they're trying to do. And my criticism of the sanctions in this piece was, when we talk about sanctions, and it's true, against other countries, it's actually, I'll come back to China and Australia and say, we look at, oh my God, we have this formidable economic arsenal. But just like war, you got to figure out what the other guy's counter strategies are. And Putin has a lot of counter strategies. I mean, one, for example, he's built up a war chest of over $630 billion in hard currency right now. In 2014, we put some sanctions on some of the elites and cronies around him. He seized property from some liberal elites and gave it to his cronies. So if you're going to use sanctions, it's not enough to use words like crippling and devastating. You've got to have a strategy. And I think they haven't. And also Europe is key. China, China buys 31% of Russian oil now. They've developed their own currency exchange system that isn't as big as the SWIFT international system that we're threatening to cut them off on, but could work. Even if it costs Xi Jinping, even if the economics aren't that good, playing that leg of the great power triangle is attractive. So I'm not sure sanctions will be as potent as they're being advertised. I don't think we should intervene militarily, right? I mean, even in the Cold War, we did not. 1956, Hungary, 1968, Czechoslovakia. You do not send troops in. First of all, there would not be support in the United States for any more than a week. But secondly, even more importantly, this is not a war you can win, right? I think deploying with a deterrent message to the Baltic states and Poland, including not just us, but the Danes and the Canadians and the English have been sending in supplies and training. I think it's a good idea. And then there's what people have been calling the porcupine strategy, which is you're trying to help the Ukrainian resistance in ways that would allow them to make the Russians' life hard. Like the Russians found out in Afghanistan. We found out too. And if there is a deterrent for Putin, that I think is a big part of it, that he can rally nationalism, but it's been 8 years now, and he's repressive, and he can keep cracking down, but you're not getting a lot of rallying around the flag, and that if it became a difficult war, which stepping up the intervention was. So there are strategies that are being played. Ultimately, I think I would pay attention the next couple of days to President Macron has said he has a call with Putin on Friday. I'm not going to say this is going to happen, but one scenario is there's a diplomatic agreement that the Europeans take the lead in. So it's not a concession to the Americans, and it's not everything America wants. But, I think could be enough to say that among the options we have, I also, to be honest with you, have long been of the view that NATO should not expand into former parts of the Soviet Union other than the Baltic states, which had their own history. And I felt that way all along. You can't agree to that now. But, this has been, my view is it's been brewing for over 30 years. Maybe there's a way, going back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we agreed to withdraw our missiles from Turkey when Khrushchev agreed to take them out of Cuba. But we didn't do it as a quid pro quo. We kind of found a way to do it. So maybe there's some diplomacy there. I really don't think that the United States gets pretty exercised when anybody tries to influence countries in our hemisphere, right? And so I really, that's my view. I think that the notion that it's a principle of international affairs to make your, there's a little bit of a Finland Cold War possibility here, which is neither East nor West, that I really think applies to Ukraine and Georgia. If he intervenes, then you are, have a problem of really one of our absolutely crucial things, which is, interstate war, which is why there was so much support in 1990-91 for the Gulf War when Saddam invaded Kuwait, and less so for the Iraq War, which was more internal. So that's my answer, being honest with you about, I've not been a supporter of NATO expansion into Ukraine. I think that the principle sounds nice, but it's simply not the way the world works. But again, how you get there now, and so I don't think the diplomatic solution can Putin in any way saying, yeah, you guys can do what you want with Ukraine.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for a detailed response to it. Talking about diplomacy, and you'd mentioned, I think, coming off the back of the Summit for Democracy, that the US was trying to show global leadership, and Biden himself has talked about relentless diplomacy. I recall a year ago we talked about how the State Department was effectively hollowed out under Donald Trump, but The Economist a couple of weeks ago ran an article saying that there are no ambassadors, for example, at the moment in Berlin or London or Rome, and there's not even an envoy in Ukraine, hasn't been since the last envoy was removed by Trump in 2019. So what message does that send in trying to deal with some of these issues? Yeah,
that's Congress. Although for some reason Biden has not nominated anybody for Ukraine. I don't really know the inside story about the why. That's kind of surprising. So Senator Cruz, as one example, put a hold on he let a few go, few in December, but on ambassadors and other, assistant secretary types, all tied to Nord Stream 2, right? Because this has become his issue. And again, if we sanction Europe into abiding by our sanctions on Nord Stream 2 and others, the message to the Russians will not be alliance solidarity, it'll be begrudging cooperation. So the Senate has some traditions. One is called putting a hold on presidential nominees. You can do it for any number of reasons. You can say, I'll let it go if you build a bridge in my state or do something else. It's gone way too far, way too far. It's not the only problem in the Senate. The use of the filibuster. We're the only country in the world that requires a supermajority, 60%, to do daily business, right? So I think that's a big part of the problem. The hollowed out that you talked about, Alistair, is a bigger problem. The State Department, as a professor, I have a lot of students who want to go into international affairs. Long before Trump, the State Department was not doing a good job of keeping up career-wise. I mean, we still have a tendency to give people different global assignments and move them around rather than let them become specialists, right? So that they don't go native, as it were, like Australia too much or something, and it's making a recruiting problem. Again, I've had a lot of my students have gone in more into the military, into the intelligence community. So we have a lot of work to do on the foreign service that got worse with Trump. Many will go into the NGO sector where they feel like they can have some impact. It's not salaries; they're not getting a very high salary there. So, and I think though also that a lot of the talk about diplomacy is not just putting more emphasis on it, but having strategies. And that my sanctions example is we really need to figure out strategy for diplomacy, not just that we want to, do it. And that's where we continue to need some more, savvy thinking. And there's some great people in this administration. really great people, smart, experienced, dedicated, but it would be nice if they could have staffed up more than they've been allowed to.
Great, thank you.
One other thing just on that I should say is we do a lot of donor appointees, which may be what your question was getting at, and that we do that much more than any country. You give a lot because our campaigns are so expensive, and ambassador to a lot of countries go to people who give a lot of money, and sometimes those are very capable people, but probably not a good idea to do as much as we do.
Just back on to US democracy, there are reports that it's becoming harder for people to vote in some states in the US. I mean, they're trying to put in different rules and regulations that's going to suppress the vote. So, it's potentially not seen so much as a beacon of democracy, either at home, but maybe also abroad. Do you think there's a genuine feeling amongst some that US democracy is seen in decline, and that's what's encouraging China or Russia to behave as they are?
I think American democracy is definitely in decline, and that's what I was saying about it. Wasn't just January 6th, but all the things that have happened since then. Changing laws, and blocking efforts in Congress. Our system has never been one where you have so much party unity that you do in a parliamentary system. And Democrats still have divisions, but Republicans used to too. And so this notion that all 50 Republicans believe that electoral reform is a bad idea is only about, trying to make it work for them. I don't think, though, that I think Russia and China have their own, China, I think, believes in its system to a great extent, right? We know its excesses. We know some of the things it's achieved internally, economically and otherwise, and scientifically. So I think that even if we hadn't had a Donald Trump, those countries, both for safeguarding the power of those that hold power, and particularly on the China side more than the Russia side, I genuinely believe that their system has some strengths. And, many of them we totally disagree with, like, genocide against groups like the Uyghurs, and repression of human rights in Hong Kong. But, even on clean energy, they've achieved a few more things than we have. They've still got a long way to go. So I don't want to make I think it gives them extra opportunities, but it's really more about their own sense of their own nationalism.
Afghanistan, we haven't really covered, but do you think the way with the withdrawal from Afghanistan happened, and what's now becoming apparent as a humanitarian crisis in the country, to what extent is that affecting US credibility overseas?
Yeah. The support for the war in Afghanistan was very low, but even those people don't at all like the way it was done. And a couple of things on the humanitarian. It's another issue of sanctions. Like, how could you possibly provide aid to a government like Taliban? But from a purely ethical point of view, you end up what's often called civilian pain, not just political pain. And so on the ethics of it, so the UN and others are trying to find. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that they're not going to change their ways, and maybe you can get some bargaining done, but the Afghan people will suffer even if aid comes through, because a lot of it is how the Taliban run the country. But I think that I think there's a deep humanitarian issue there. On the withdrawal, it was. I think that. So going back to 2009, when I was in the State Department, I was not involved in Afghanistan issues. I was involved in others. But even then, when Biden was vice president, we entertained three options, and each one was a different level of troops. We didn't really talk about diplomacy. And I remember at the time, there was Henry Kissinger and Richard Holbrooke, who were both making the argument that, I've adopted it, but I attribute it to them at the time, that what you really needed to do was classic, major power diplomacy with all the countries who had interests in the region, the Russians, the Chinese, the Saudis, the Iranians, the Pakistanis, the Indians. Basically, look, you guys have all been benefiting from us being there, because you could meddle around with your favorite groups, and we're paying the price, with our military and our expenditures. We're going to get out. And so, we need to have some efforts to all avoid worst case scenarios here. Can there be some ways that the major powers, and we didn't do that. And I think China's having some second thoughts about it now. Russia is, others are. And so we were left with knowing what we didn't want to do and not what we wanted to do. And I do fault my colleagues in the Biden administration because that's how they approached it. We're getting out. And so it comes back to our point about diplomacy. You have to think about not just not using force, but what's your strategy. And I do believe it was the right thing to get out. I don't think staying 6 months, 2 more years would have made a significant difference. We also didn't, for example, involve the UN. I mean, this was a classic example for the High Commissioner on Refugees that has expertise and can mobilize countries we can't to have been part of that. So there are a lot of things we didn't do that would have never made it clean, but could have made it not as bad.
We're reaching the end of our time. So I've got just one last question. I think we've covered most of the topics that have come up, but the Summit for Democracy itself, how much coverage did that get domestically in the States? Was there a lot of attention paid, or did people overlook it?
Inside the Beltway. A lot of articles, by people like me saying that should have done it, others saying, well, look, at least we got, who looked just on the positive column and not a net assessment. It didn't matter at all to Americans. To be honest with you, the promotion of democracy, if you look at polling done over a number of years by groups like the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, it does not come out as a high priority. And some of it is, does it work, right? How do you actually do this, right? Which we haven't talked about, but is its own issue. So, the Biden people, I think, thought there was political advantage with certain groups to which it mattered. But no, there was not, wow, we're for democracy, especially with the timing, and then Omicron was hitting, and we had our own problems. And so, no, there was no real payoff there.
Well, that doesn't altogether surprise me, but I think it neatly brings us to the end of another great coverage of these topical issues. So Bruce, it's great to have you back. Thank you very much. And as you say, we will strive to one day try and do this in person.
I would love it.
But
in fact, probably have more than a flat white over the course of time. Thank you. Great. Thanks again.
Thank you. And thank you to the audience for dialing in. Thank you to Bruce joining us late in your evening on Wednesday from Washington. Many more topics to come this year, but it's been a great start to the year. So thank you to all of you for joining us. Thanks again, Bruce.
Bye-bye.